It was in the early part of '96, a year which was to prove remarkable for a series of cases both bizarre and instructive, that the singular affair of old Mrs. Harold first came to the attention of my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. London was in the grip of a persistent November fog, a great suffocating blanket of ochre-coloured vapour that swirled in ghostly wreaths down Baker Street, pressing its foul face against our window panes and rendering the world outside a vague and phantom-like procession of muffled sounds and indistinct shapes. The gas lamps, lit since noon, glowed with a sickly spectral light that did little to pierce the gloom. Within our comfortable lodgings at 221B, however, all was warmth and industry. A cheery fire blazed in the hearth, and Holmes, who was ever a creature of extremes, had emerged from a 2-day torpor of melancholic violin-playing to throw himself with ferocious energy into a chemical experiment. The air was thick with an acrid, penetrating odour which I had come to associate with his most abstruse researches, and the great deal table was a chaotic litter of retorts, test tubes and Bunsen burners, amidst which my friend darted and peered, a long glass pipette in his hand, his hawk-like features illuminated by the flickering blue flame. "Watson, you are a medical man," he said, without turning round. "You are familiar with the various alkaloids derived from the poppy. Have you ever, in your practice, encountered a case of poisoning by laudanozine?" "In its pure form? Never," I replied, looking up from my paper. "It is a rare and convulsant poison, is it not? Far less common than its cousins, morphine or codeine. I cannot recall a single instance mentioned in the journals." "Precisely," he cried, whirling around with a gleam of triumph in his deep-set eyes. "It is obscure. Its symptoms, violent tetanic seizures, could easily be mistaken by an inexperienced practitioner for some acute neurological disorder, epilepsy perhaps, or even strychnine. And yet its chemical signature is entirely unique. Observe." He added a single drop of a clear fluid to a test tube containing a bluish solution. In an instant the contents turned a brilliant shimmering emerald green. "A reagent of my own devising," he remarked, setting the tube in its rack with a contented sigh. "A definitive test. It may be of some service to the Crown one day. Ah, what have we here?" His last remark was prompted by the sudden appearance of our page, Billy, who had entered with a visiting card upon a silver salver. Holmes took the card, glanced at it, and raised his eyebrows in amusement. "Mr. Septimus Croft," he read aloud, "of the firm Croft and Endicott Solicitors, a name that positively reeks of dusty ledgers and disputed wills. I wonder what triviality brings a man of law into this pea-soup fog. Show him up, Billy." A few moments later our visitor was ushered into the room. He was a small, desiccated man, bird-like in his movements, with a fringe of white hair around a polished pink scalp. He was dressed in immaculate but old-fashioned black, and he clutched a leather portfolio to his chest as if it were a shield against the world. He blinked in the gaslight, his pale eyes darting from the chemical apparatus to the Persian slipper full of tobacco, and finally resting upon my singular companion. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he chirped, his voice as dry as autumn leaves. Holmes bowed with a languid grace. "I am he. This is my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson, in whose presence you may speak freely. Pray take a seat by the fire. You seem chilled." "It is the fog, sir. It penetrates to the very bone," the solicitor replied, settling himself gingerly upon the edge of a chair. But my business is not of my own choosing. I come on behalf of a client, or rather the memory of a client. A posthumous commission? Holmes's interest was piqued. He pushed aside a rack of test tubes and leaned forward, his long, thin fingers steepled before him. You might call it that, Mr. Holmes. I am the executor of the estate of the late Mrs. Eleanor Harold, who passed away peacefully in her sleep 3 nights ago at her residence in Kensington. I am sorry for your loss, I murmured, more from habit than any real sentiment for a woman I had never known. The sentiment is appreciated, Doctor, though hardly necessary, said Mr. Croft with a thin smile. Mrs. Harold was 87 years of age. She had lived a full life and was, by all accounts, ready for her final rest. Her physician, a Dr. Armitage, has signed the certificate without hesitation. Cause of death? Cardiac failure due to advanced age. Then I fail to see where I might be of service, said Holmes, a hint of impatience in his tone. I am a consulting detective, not an undertaker. Of course, the little man said hastily, opening his portfolio. The issue is not with the death itself, which was entirely expected, but with the will. Mrs. Harold was a woman of considerable means. Her late husband was in shipping. The estate is valued at something over £100,000. Holmes emitted a low whistle. A substantial sum? And there are, I take it, disappointed heirs? That is the nub of the matter, Mr. Holmes. For the past 20 years, Mrs. Harold's will has been unchanged. The entirety of her fortune was to be left to her sole living relative, a grandnephew by the name of Mr. Julian Forrester. He has lived with her for the last decade, acting as her companion and secretary. A charming, if somewhat indolent, young man. And she has changed the will? Dramatically. 1 week ago, I was summoned to her house. She was in a state of some agitation. She dictated a new will, which I drew up and had her sign in the presence of 2 witnesses, the cook and the parlour-maid. This new instrument revokes all previous testaments. Save for a generous annuity to her staff, the entire £100,000 is to be bequeathed to a Mr. Aloysius Pinner for the foundation of a home for indigent Egyptologists. I could not suppress a start of surprise. Holmes, however, merely smiled. "Excellent," he murmured. "A home for indigent Egyptologists. It has a certain rococo charm, does it not? And who, pray tell, is this Mr. Pinner, this patron of impoverished scholars?" "That, Mr. Holmes, is the problem," Mr. Croft confessed, his face a mask of professional bewilderment. "I have no idea. The name is unknown to me. I have made discreet enquiries. He is not listed in any directory. He is not a known figure in academic circles. As far as I can ascertain, Mr. Aloysius Pinner does not exist." "And the nephew, Mr. Forrester? How has he taken this sudden disinheritance?" "With remarkable equanimity, all things considered. He professes himself utterly baffled. He claims his great-aunt had never shown the slightest interest in Egyptology. Her passions were orchids and Pekingese dogs. He fears she may have fallen under some malign influence in her final days, or that her mind had begun to wander." "That is the obvious conclusion," said Holmes, rising and beginning to pace before the fire. "And yet you are not satisfied, Mr. Croft. Why?" The solicitor hesitated, polishing his spectacles with a silk handkerchief. "It is a small thing, Mr. Holmes, a trifle, but it has lodged in my mind. When I was taking my leave of Mrs. Harold, after the new will was signed and witnessed, she pressed a small object into my hand. He reached into his waistcoat pocket and placed something on the mantelpiece. It was a common tin thimble. She leaned close and whispered to me, "See that Julian gets this. It is all I have left for him." I was, I admit, taken aback. She was a formal woman, not given to such cryptic gestures. I thought it a sign of her encroaching senility. I did not give the matter another thought until after her death. When I presented the thimble to Mr. Forrester, he was as mystified as I. It holds no sentimental value for him. It is not a family heirloom. It is merely a thimble. Holmes picked up the object, turning it over between his long, nimble fingers. He carried it to the window, examining it under the dismal yellow light with a powerful lens. "And this is what has brought you here?" he asked. "A woman of 87 changes her will in favour of a non-existent Egyptologist, and your primary concern is a common thimble." "It is the irrationality of it, sir," the solicitor cried, his professional composure cracking at last. "The will I can almost understand. An old woman's fancy, a sudden whim, a mental decay. But the thimble, it feels deliberate. It feels like a message, and I, for one, cannot decipher it. I feel I am failing in my duty as her executor if I do not at least attempt to understand her final, peculiar wish." Holmes stood silent for a long moment, his brow furrowed in thought. The thimble was still held delicately in his hand. "You say Dr. Armitage saw the body?" he asked at length. "He did. He is an old friend of the family. He saw no reason for any further examination." "And the body has not yet been interred?" "The funeral is scheduled for the day after tomorrow." "Then we have no time to lose." Holmes's eyes shone with the hard, clear light of a man who suddenly sees his path before him. The languor was gone, replaced by the electric energy I knew so well. "Watson, your hat and coat. Mr. Croft, you will be good enough to accompany us to Kensington at once. The death of Mrs. Harold may have been peaceful, but I suspect her final days were anything but. This is a three-thimble problem, Watson, and it promises to be a most stimulating one. The journey to Kensington was a silent and sombre one, a passage through a Danton underworld of swirling fog and muffled cries. The cabman, a shadowy figure perched high on his box, navigated by instinct more than sight, the wheels of his hansom splashing through unseen puddles, and the horse's breath pluming white in the jaundiced glow of the street lamps. Mr. Croft sat hunched in his corner, a picture of misery, while Holmes, his chin upon his chest and his hat drawn low over his eyes, seemed to have sunk into the profoundest of meditations. I knew from long experience that it was in these moments of apparent lethargy that his mind was working at its most feverish pace, piecing together the scant facts, forming and rejecting a dozen hypotheses. Our destination was a tall, narrow-fronted house in a respectable but melancholy square, its brickwork stained dark by years of London soot. A flight of stone steps, slick with damp, led up to a heavy, black-painted door, and as Mr. Croft's trembling hand reached for the bell-pull, I felt a palpable sense of gloom emanate from the silent edifice, a house that had so recently been visited by death. The door was opened by a woman of middle years, tall and severe of aspect, with iron-grey hair pulled back so tightly that it seemed to drag the skin of her forehead with it. She was dressed in black bombazine and wore a crisp white apron. "This," Mr. Croft whispered, was Mrs. Gable, the cook-housekeeper, who had been in Mrs. Harold's service for 30 years. "Mr. Croft, sir?" she said, her voice low and devoid of emotion. "Mr. Julian is in the drawing-room. He is expecting you." She led us through a chilly hall, panelled in dark oak and smelling faintly of beeswax and decay. The only light came from a gas jet turned low, which cast long dancing shadows that seemed to mock the funereal stillness of the house. From a room to our right, a door stood ajar, and I caught a glimpse of a young man who sprang to his feet as we entered. Mr. Julian Forrester was a man of perhaps 30 years, blessed with the sort of easy, classical good looks that often prove a curse. His fair hair was artfully dishevelled, his features regular, and his blue eyes held an expression of weary appeal. He was dressed in a well-cut, if slightly ostentatious, smoking jacket of dark velvet. At the sight of Holmes and myself, his eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Mr. Croft," he said, his voice a pleasant baritone, though with a slight tremor in it. "I had not expected visitors." "My apologies, Mr. Forrester," the solicitor said, making the introductions. "Mr. Holmes is a specialist. I have engaged him to look into the peculiarities surrounding your great-aunt's final testament. This is his associate, Dr. Watson." Forrester's face, which had been pale, flushed a deep red. "A specialist? You mean a detective? Good heavens, Croft, is that entirely necessary? It is a family matter. A sad and bewildering one, I grant you, but surely not one for the police or their like." "I am not the police, young man," said Holmes, his voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "I am here as a humble seeker after truth. Your great-aunt's will is a document of some legal standing. If it is found to be based upon a delusion, it may be set aside. If, however, it is based upon something more tangible, then it is my duty to unearth it. I take it you have no objection to the truth?" "None whatsoever," Forrester retorted, though his eyes shifted uncomfortably. "I love my aunt. I want only what is right. But this feels like a ghoulish intrusion. The poor woman is not yet in her grave." "The truth is rarely concerned with etiquette," Holmes observed coolly. "With your permission, I should like to see the room in which your great-aunt passed away. And I should also like to speak with the 2 servants who witnessed the signing of the new will." Forrester hesitated for a second, then gave a sigh of resignation. "As you wish. Mrs. Gable witnessed it, as did Mary, the parlour-maid. I will send for her. My aunt's rooms are on the floor above. She has not been disturbed." As he moved to pull the bell rope, Holmes held up a hand. "One moment, Mrs. Gable, you were one of the witnesses. Would you be so good as to recount the events of that afternoon?" The housekeeper clasped her hands before her face as impassive as a stone carving. "There is little to tell, sir. Mr. Croft arrived at 3. I was called up to the mistress's sitting-room along with Mary. The mistress was in her chair by the fire. She looked flushed, excited, you might say. Mr. Croft read the document, she signed it, and Mary and I signed after her. That was all." "Did she say anything?" Holmes asked. "She thanked us for our service. She said we would be well taken care of." "And her demeanour? You say she was excited. Was that usual for her?" "No, sir. For the past few months she had been very quiet, listless. That day she had a fire in her eyes I had not seen for years." "And you, Mr. Forrester? Where were you during this?" "I was asked to leave," he said, a note of bitterness in his voice. "Aunt Eleanor said it was a private legal matter. I went to my club. I returned after 5, and Mr. Croft had long since departed. She was tired then and retired to bed early." "I see. Now, if you would be so good as to lead the way upstairs." We followed the young man up a broad, thickly carpeted staircase to the first floor. He opened a door and stood aside, allowing us to enter the late Mrs. Harold's private sanctum. It was composed of 2 rooms, a sitting room and an adjoining bedroom, both furnished in the heavy, overstuffed style of a bygone era. The air was close and still, carrying the faint sweet scent of lavender and old age. The sitting room was dominated by a large fireplace, its grate cold and swept clean, and a bay window that looked out upon the misty square. It was a room of feminine pursuits. A sewing basket stood by a chair, its contents overflowing. A delicate writing desk was covered in neat stacks of correspondence. And on a small table stood a magnificent orchid, its waxy purple-spotted petals drooping sadly. Holmes, however, paid little heed to these general impressions. He moved at once into the bedroom, a much smaller chamber, where a great 4-poster bed took up most of the space. The bedclothes were turned down, as if awaiting an occupant who would never return. It was here that Mrs. Harold had been found, having passed away, as Mr. Croft had said, peacefully in her sleep. "Dr. Armitage examined her in this room?" Holmes asked Mr. Forrester, who hovered nervously by the door. "He did. He said her heart had simply given out." Holmes said nothing, but dropped to his hands and knees, his sharp face darting here and there, examining the carpet, the valance of the bed, the very casters of the nightstand. I, meanwhile, allowed my own medical eye to roam the room. On the bedside table stood a carafe of water and a glass, a Bible and a small brown bottle of digitalis, drops, a common prescription for a weak heart. I picked it up. It was from a reputable local chemist and was nearly full. Nothing seemed out of place. It was the very picture of a peaceful, natural end. "Watson, come here." Holmes's voice was low and urgent. He was still on his knees, pointing to something on the dark, polished floorboards near the head of the bed. "What do you make of this?" I knelt beside him. At first I could see nothing but the reflection of the gaslight on the wood. Then, following his pointing finger, I discerned it. A single, tiny, almost microscopic scratch on the polish, no more than 1/8 of an inch long. It was a clean, sharp mark, as if made by a fine metal point. "A pin, perhaps?" I suggested. "Dropped from a pincushion?" "Perhaps, Watson, and perhaps not." He rose to his feet and turned his attention to the bed itself, running his long, sensitive fingers over the sheets and the pillow. Suddenly he stopped. "Aha!" He held up his hand. Pinched between his thumb and forefinger was a single coarse, reddish-brown hair. "Our late Mrs. Harold was white-haired, was she not?" he mused, holding the hair to the light. "And Mr. Forrester is fair. Mrs. Gable is iron-grey, and I would wager the parlour-maid is a brunette. This, Watson, is the hair of a visitor with reddish-brown hair who stood here by the head of the bed, and was careless enough to drop this small token. A visitor, moreover, who may have been careless enough to drop something else." He crossed back to the sitting-room and went directly to the overflowing sewing basket. Ignoring the silks and threads, he plunged his hand deep inside, rummaging for a moment before letting out a grunt of satisfaction. He withdrew his hand and opened it. Lying on his palm were 3 more tin thimbles, identical in every respect to the one that sat upon our mantelpiece in Baker Street. "Curious, is it not?" he remarked, his eyes glittering. "A woman with a plentiful supply of thimbles chooses to give one, just one, to her solicitor as a final cryptic message for her nephew. Why that particular one? What distinguishes it from its fellows?" He took the original thimble from his pocket and compared it with the others. To my eye, they were all the same. But Holmes, with his lens, was subjecting each to an intense scrutiny. "The game is afoot, Watson," he whispered, his voice vibrating with suppressed excitement. "There is a difference, a minute, almost imperceptible difference. Look here, at the base of this one, the one from Mr. Croft." He handed me the lens and the thimble. Following his direction, I examined the rolled metal edge at its base. There, so small that it was almost invisible to the naked eye, was a tiny indentation, a minuscule nick in the metal, as if it had been used to press against something far harder and sharper than a needle's eye. It was the sort of detail that only Sherlock Holmes would ever have observed. At that moment the door opened, and the parlour-maid, a young woman with frightened rabbit-like eyes, was ushered in by Mrs. Gable. "This is Mary, sir," the housekeeper announced. Holmes turned to her, his manner instantly changing from that of the keen-eyed hunter to a kindly, reassuring gentleman. "Mary, is it? Do not be alarmed. I merely wish to ask you about the day you witnessed your mistress's will." "Yes, sir," she whispered, twisting the corner of her apron. "You saw her sign the paper?" "Yes, sir, clear as day." "And was she well? In good spirits?" "Oh, yes, sir. Better than I'd seen her in a long time. She had a visitor that morning, you see, and it seemed to cheer her up wonderfully." Holmes's head snapped up. "A visitor? Mr. Croft did not mention a visitor. Mr. Forrester, you said nothing of this." "I knew nothing of it," the young man replied, his face a study in confusion. "Who was it, Mary?" "I don't know, sir," the girl stammered. "He was a gentleman. I'd never seen him before. He came around 11 o'clock. The mistress had sent me out with a note for him earlier to an address in Bloomsbury." "A note?" Holmes's voice was sharp. "And this gentleman came in response to it? What did he look like?" "He was tall, sir, and thin, and very intense-looking. He had reddish-brown hair, sir, and a beard of the same colour. He was carrying a small black leather bag." The hair. I exchanged a glance with Holmes. His theory of a visitor was already proven correct. "And how long did he stay?" "About an hour, sir. He was with the mistress in this very room. I brought them tea, but when I came to collect the tray, the door was locked." "Locked?" This was a startling development. "Yes, sir. The mistress called out that she was not to be disturbed. The gentleman left by the garden door. The mistress said he was a very private man and did not care for comings and goings. And his name? Did you hear her call him by name?" The girl thought for a moment. I think she called him Mr. Pinner." The name fell into the quiet room with the force of a thunderclap. Aloysius Pinner, the non-existent Egyptologist, the beneficiary of £100,000, was not a phantom after all. He was a man of flesh and blood, a man with reddish-brown hair who had visited Mrs. Harold on the very day she changed her will, and who had been locked in a room with her for an hour. Holmes turned to Julian Forrester, his expression grim. Mr. Forrester, your great-aunt did not, I think, have a sudden fancy for Egyptology. She had a sudden and very real visitor. Our task now is to discover who this Mr. Pinner is and what hold he had over the unfortunate Mrs. Harold. He paused, and his gaze fell upon the small brown bottle of heart medication on the bedside table. "And we must also discover," he added softly, "if a dose of digitalis was all that she took on the night of her death." The investigation had now taken a far more sinister turn. The vague unease of Mr. Croft had solidified into a tangible suspicion of foul play. As we left the house of mourning and stepped back out into the clinging London fog, I knew that we stood upon the threshold of a dark and complex mystery. The name of Pinner was our only guide, a single flickering candle in a vast and Stygian darkness. The question that hung in the air, as heavy and oppressive as the fog itself, was whether we could find him before the trail grew cold, and what terrible truth we would unearth when we did. For my part, I could not shake the image of that tiny scratch on the floorboards, a minute and insignificant detail that had, I felt with a cold certainty, been left by the key that would unlock this entire grim affair. Our first port of call, upon returning to Baker Street, was the telegraph office, from which Holmes dispatched a flurry of messages. One, I knew, was to his brother Mycroft, whose peculiar and extensive knowledge of the civil service might unearth a Mr. Pinner who had eluded all other directories. Another was to a certain shipping agent in the city, and a third to a less reputable source, a man named Sherman, who kept a network of informants among the city's beggars and street Arabs, a group Holmes referred to as the Baker Street Division of the detective police force. "Information, Watson, is like milk," he remarked, as we settled back into our armchairs, the fire once more chasing the November chill from our bones. "It is best when fresh. By morning we shall have a torrent or a trickle. In the meantime, we must reason upon the data we possess." "The case certainly seems to have narrowed," I observed. "We are no longer looking for a phantom, but for a man with reddish-brown hair who calls himself Pinner. He visits Mrs. Harold, is locked in with her, and a few hours later she changes her will in his favour. It suggests some form of blackmail or undue influence. It is the obvious conclusion, and therefore the one we must be most suspicious of," Holmes countered, lighting his foul-smelling clay pipe. "Consider the difficulties. If this Pinner were a common blackmailer, would he invent such a fantastic and conspicuous story as a home for indigent Egyptologists? Would he not simply have the money made out to himself? It is too theatrical, Watson, too bizarre. It is a blind, designed to send us chasing after mummies and sarcophagi, while the real business is conducted elsewhere." "And the thimble?" I asked. "Where does that fit into your calculations?" "Ah, the thimble. It is the very centrepiece of the affair. Everything revolves around that tiny scrap of tin. She gives it to Croft, her man of law. 'See that Julian gets this,' she says. 'It is all I have left for him.' An extraordinary statement. She had just signed away a fortune, yet she speaks of the thimble as being his entire inheritance. Why? Perhaps it contains a message, I ventured. A tiny scrap of paper rolled up inside. I have already examined it for such a thing. It is empty. No, the message is the thimble itself, and the key to that message, I believe, is the tiny nick on its base. A thimble is used to push a needle through fabric. What if this thimble was used to push something else? Something small and sharp. That scratch on the floor, Watson. It was not a pinprick, it was a mark of leverage, Someone knelt there and pressed down with great force on a fine point. He fell silent, and for the better part of an hour the only sound in the room was the bubbling of his pipe and the frantic scribbling of my own pen as I sought to set down the singular events of the day in my journal. The evening papers brought the first trickle of information, though it was of a negative sort. There was no Mr. Aloysius Pinner listed in any of the academic societies, gentlemen's clubs, or directories of scholars. He was, as Mr. Croft had discovered, a man without a public footprint. The replies to Holmes's telegrams would not begin to arrive until the morning. It was shortly after 9 o'clock that we were disturbed by a loud and frantic knocking at our door downstairs. A moment later, Billy threw open our door, his face pale, to announce a visitor. It was none other than Mr. Julian Forrester. The indolent young man we had met that afternoon was gone. In his place was a creature of sheer terror. His face was ashen, his hair was wild, and his fine velvet jacket was torn at the shoulder. He stumbled into the room, his eyes wide with a frantic, hunted look. "Holmes!" he gasped, clutching at the back of a chair for support. "Thank God I have found you. I am in danger. My life is in danger." "Calm yourself, Mr. Forrester, and tell us what has occurred," Holmes said, his voice steady and reassuring as he pushed a glass of brandy into the young man's trembling hand. "I was followed," Forrester said, after gulping down the spirit. "After you left, I felt uneasy. The house was so quiet, so full of shadows. I decided to go to my club for supper. As I was walking through the square, I became aware of a man behind me. He kept to the shadows, but I could see him in the patches of gaslight. A tall, thin man." "And did he have reddish-brown hair?" Holmes asked quietly. Forrester stared at him, his jaw agape. "How could you possibly know that? Yes, he did. I could see it under his hat. I began to walk faster, and he quickened his pace. I broke into a run, and he ran after me. He chased me through the streets of Kensington. I lost him near the underground station and took a cab here directly. He means to harm me, Mr. Holmes. I am certain of it. It is this man, this Pinner. He has taken my inheritance, and now he wants my life." "That is a grave charge," said Holmes, his face serious. "Did you see his face clearly?" "Only for a moment. He had a beard and spectacles, I think. But it was his eyes, Mr. Holmes. They were merciless." "I see. You have acted wisely in coming to me, Mr. Forrester. You will, of course, spend the night here. We have a spare bedroom, and you will be safer within these walls than anywhere else in London. Watson, you might look at his shoulder. It seems he took a tumble in his flight." While I attended to the young man's superficial scrape, Holmes paced the floor, his brow clouded with thought. The case had taken another sharp and unexpected turn. Pinner was no longer a shadowy influencer of old ladies. He was a physical pursuer, a figure of menace stalking the foggy streets. "This complicates matters," Holmes murmured, more to himself than to us. "Our quarry is aware that he is being hunted. Your visit to me, Mr. Croft's visit, the news has reached him. He is attempting to frighten you, Mr. Forrester, to warn you off. The question is, what does he fear you know?" "I know nothing," the young man cried. "I am as much in the dark as anyone." "Perhaps," said Holmes, fixing him with a piercing gaze, "and perhaps you know something without being aware of its significance. Think, man, think. In the last few weeks, did your great-aunt receive any unusual visitors, apart from Pinner? Any strange letters? Did she acquire any new objects? Did she speak of the past, of old acquaintances? Forrester shook his head, his face a mask of weary confusion. Nothing. She was obsessed with her orchids. That was all. She spent hours in her glass house at the back of the garden. She talked to them as if they were her children. Other than that, her life was a quiet routine of meals, naps, and reading the society pages of the Morning Post. "The orchids," Holmes said softly, his eyes taking on a distant, dreamy look. "You mentioned them this afternoon. She was a woman of passions, you said. Orchids and Pekingese dogs." "She had a dog, yes. A ghastly, yapping little creature named Fu Manchu. It died last year. But the orchids remained. Tell me about them, Mr. Forrester. Were they rare?" "Exceedingly. She corresponded with collectors all over the world. She had specimens from Borneo, from the Amazon, one she called the crimson moth, a horrid-looking thing that only bloomed at night. It was her pride and joy." Holmes suddenly stopped his pacing. "Where is this glass house?" "At the end of the garden, but it is locked. My aunt was the only one with a key." "There is no lock that cannot be opened," Holmes said with a thin smile. "Mr. Forrester, your ordeal has given us a new line of inquiry. I had intended to wait for my telegrams, but action is now required. Watson, the hour is late, but the fog is our friend. It will shield us from prying eyes. Fetch your service revolver and a stout walking stick. We are going back to Kensington. We are going to pay a visit to the late Mrs. Harold's orchids." And so it was that, close on midnight, two shadowy figures, a tall, gaunt man and his shorter, more stocky companion, slipped out of a hansom cab at the corner of a quiet Kensington square. The fog was thicker than ever, reducing visibility to a mere few feet and muffling our footsteps as we crept along the railings of the silent houses. Using a set of skeleton keys which Holmes carried with him for such nocturnal expeditions, he made short work of the tradesman's entrance to Mrs. Harold's house. We passed like ghosts through the darkened garden, a sad, dripping place of dead leaves and skeletal shrubs, until we came to a small structure of glass and iron at the far end. The glass house was also locked, but the flimsy mechanism proved no match for Holmes's skill. A moment later we were inside, the door closed silently behind us. The air within was warm and humid, thick with the heavy cloying scent of damp earth and exotic blossoms. Even in the darkness I could make out the strange, alien shapes of the plants that surrounded us, their leaves and tendrils creating a dense, jungle-like profusion. Holmes struck a match and lit a dark lantern he had brought, its single focused beam cutting a path through the gloom. The collection was indeed remarkable. There were plants of every shape and size, their blossoms ranging from the most delicate shades of white and pink to the most lurid crimsons and purples. Many were perched on pieces of bark or growing from hanging baskets, their aerial roots twisting down like pale grasping fingers. "A strange and expensive hobby, Watson," Holmes murmured, playing the beam of his lantern over a particularly grotesque specimen that resembled a spotted, fleshy spider. "It requires patience, knowledge, and a great deal of money. Our Mrs. Harold was a woman of dedication." He moved slowly along the central aisle, examining each plant with care. I followed behind, my hand on the reassuring butt of my revolver, for I confess that the strange, silent atmosphere of the place had begun to work upon my nerves. It was easy to imagine some venomous creature lurking amongst the dense foliage. "What are we looking for, Holmes?" I whispered. "I'm not entirely sure. A clue, something out of place, something that might connect this bizarre horticultural passion with a non-existent Egyptologist and a man with reddish-brown hair. Forrester said she spent hours here. This was her private world. If she had a secret, Watson, it is likely to be hidden here." He had reached the far end of the glass house, where one plant stood apart from the others on a special tiered stand. It was a large, ungainly orchid with broad, leathery leaves. From its centre rose a single spike, which bore a dozen or more closed buds. "This must be the crimson moth," Holmes said, examining it closely. "Her pride and joy, according to Forrester. See the care that has been taken with it. The compost is freshly turned, the leaves have been wiped clean." His lantern beam travelled down the stem of the plant to the pot in which it was planted. It was a simple terracotta pot, but the soil around the base of the orchid seemed disturbed. It was looser than the packed earth in the other pots. Holmes set down his lantern and, taking a penknife from his pocket, began to carefully probe the soft compost. He had been digging for no more than a minute when the blade of his knife struck something hard with a dull clink. "As I suspected," he breathed, his voice tight with excitement. He began to scrape away the soil with his fingers, revealing the corner of a small metal box. Carefully he worked it free and lifted it out. It was a tin cash box, about 6 inches square, and it was unexpectedly heavy. It was locked. "No matter," Holmes muttered, producing his set of keys once more. A moment of delicate manipulation, a soft click, and the lid sprang open. I leaned over his shoulder, my heart pounding with anticipation. The box was filled to the brim, not with jewels or money, but with bundles of letters tied neatly with ribbon. But that was not all. On top of the letters lay a small, velvet-lined jeweller's case. Holmes opened it. Inside, nestled on the faded velvet, was not a piece of jewellery, but a most extraordinary object. It was a large, beautifully crafted scarab beetle, fashioned from a single piece of lapis lazuli, its back intricately carved with Egyptian hieroglyphs. "Good heavens, Holmes!" I exclaimed. "Egyptology!" "Precisely, Watson. It seems the late Mrs. Harold's interests were not, after all, confined to orchids. She had at least 1 foot in the land of the pharaohs. But it is this that is of more immediate interest." He had lifted out the top bundle of letters. He untied the ribbon and unfolded the topmost sheet. In the beam of the lantern I could read the faint, spidery handwriting. The letter began without preamble. "My dearest Eleanor, the consignment arrived safely. The moth is a marvel, more beautiful than I had dared to hope. But you must be careful. The risks we are taking are immense. He is growing suspicious, I am sure of it. He watches my every move. If he were ever to discover the true nature of our little enterprise, I dare not think of the consequences. Burn this letter, I implore you. Burn them all." The letter was signed only with the initial A. Holmes read it, and then the next and the next, his face growing ever more grim in the lantern light. "Watson," he said at last, his voice low and serious, "we have stumbled upon something far deeper and more tragic than a mere dispute over a will. This is a story of secrets and lies that goes back 30 years, and the name of our red-haired man is not Pinner. That is an alias. His real name, I would stake my reputation upon it, is Armitage." "Armitage!" I cried. "You mean the doctor? The family friend?" "The very same. Doctor, blackmailer, and I strongly suspect murderer." He carefully packed the letters and the scarab back into the box and closed the lid. "We must get this back to Baker Street at once. The final pieces of the puzzle are falling into place. The thimble, the scratch on the floor, the locked room, the sudden visitor. It is all part of one coherent and devilish plot. Tomorrow, Watson, we shall pay a visit to Dr. Armitage, and I fancy we shall find him a most interesting conversationalist. I only hope that young Forrester remains safe until then." As we made our way back through the sleeping city, the tin box resting safely in Holmes's greatcoat pocket, I pondered the extraordinary turn of events. A hidden correspondence, a secret enterprise, and a respectable physician unmasked as a villain of the deepest dye. The death of old Mrs. Harold, which had seemed so peaceful and natural, was now revealed as the final act in a long and desperate tragedy, and I knew that the climax of the case, when it came, would be a terrible one. The game, as Holmes would say, was most certainly afoot.